I want to thank Hervé and all the students who've pulled together this day. It's an exciting conversation to be a part of. And so I want to take up the three overarching questions for the conference. What is applied anthropology? What is its relationship to anthropology? And what is anthropology doing in a school of education? Or what should it be doing? And so I want to argue, kind of in line with some of what we've heard today, particularly in Jean's talk, that we are all applied anthropologists, or that all anthropologists are applied. And to do that, I want to draw from some applied anthropologists whose work I admire, and also from post-structural and post-colonial critiques of knowledge politics. And then in my conclusion, try to come around to two criteria for thinking about good anthropology across these divides, and potentially for thinking about what a curriculum might look like. So I am going to go back to the definition of applied anthropology that Michael decimated in his presentation, which is Van Willingen's definition of anthropology put to use. I think that's a valuable place for us to start. Perhaps we could debate that definition, but it's one for us to think with. And so when I think about anthropology put to use, I think, again, we are all applied. We certainly do, even those in academic positions, put anthropology to use. We think of anthropology as good to think with. We teach anthropology. Teaching is a form of putting anthropology to use, as Lesley Sharp talked to us about this morning. We teach anthropological principles to our students, and we try to shift them, perhaps even undermine some of their cherished assumptions, or shift their ways of thinking about people who are culturally and socially distinct from them. We teach about the dangers of ethnocentrism. These sorts of things, I think, are part of applying anthropology. We could think of research itself as a form of anthropology put to use. Given our commitment to understanding the cultural logics that research participants use, and foregrounding those logics, as Willis said, at least partly in their own terms, ethnography calls for this form of engagement and positioning that's distinct from other methodologies. The research process itself requires us to put our anthropology to use in interactions with other people. And when we ask ourselves those uncomfortable and perennial questions about reciprocity and representation, we're taking up anthropological perspectives and applying them to our research relationships. But we put anthropology to use in other ways as well. Since at least the 1940s, if not before, there have been these cyclical calls for engaged, applied, or public anthropology, for efforts to move beyond the academy and have some sort of impact. So post-structural theory may have dampened those efforts a bit with its allergy to truth and to truth claims, but nonetheless, it is this call that comes around. So in the early 2000s, Borofsky and others engaged, Jim Peacock, as Jean was discussing, exhorted us to engage in public anthropology, which he said demonstrates the ability of anthropology and anthropologists to effectively address problems beyond the discipline, illuminating larger social issues of our times, as well as encouraging broad public conversations about them with the explicit goal of fostering social change. Right? So the field itself is awash in these waves of calls for engagement and relevance. And people like Meryl Singer have quite understandably criticized that labeling, that decision to call it activist or public anthropology instead of applied, asking why this need to distance the field from applied anthropology. So, as much as we anthropologists do love our categorical and dichotomous thinking, like nature-nurture, structure-agency, raw-cooked, threw that one in there for you, Hervé, we have to acknowledge that this kind of dichotomous thinking, there was a beautiful phrase in Jean's talk that I wrote down but have misplaced my slip of paper. These binaries are limited and at times dangerous. We need to think about who decides what is applied and what is whatever not applied is, pure, and why the need to distinguish these forms of anthropology. Well, there are many reasons, as some of the applied anthropologists themselves have noted. One is the critique of anthropology's dirty side, its entanglements with colonialism and national security efforts. It reminds me of the evil twin narrative of Ferguson that Scott mentioned earlier. But the early histories of all forms of anthropology are largely the same history, right? We have to acknowledge the support of colonial structures for anthropology as a discipline itself. So in some ways, this distinction of applied anthropology being kind of the politically compromised one is just a slight to make others feel a little cleaner about the kind of work that they do. There's also then this presumed theory-practice divide that has come up a few times, and naming applied as distinct from anthropology creates this sense of distance vis-a-vis the lower prestige realm, according to that the practical is assigned. And I want to argue that I feel like this is an odd and contradictory stance for a discipline that creates knowledge from experience. I feel like that effort to divide or to claim a theory-practice divide is almost a kind of self-hatred that we really need to think very carefully about. A fourth reason then relates to the fundamental dilemma in anthropology that we've heard reverberate throughout the day over whether one should work as an outside critic or an inside ameliorator within arenas of power and of policy. And the former affords some rhetorical freedom, but rarely results in the significant social change that many of us hope for. The insider role, in contrast, has limitations. It certainly has risks, such as co-optation, but it does offer more opportunities for that kind of impact. However, it is disingenuous a bit for anthropologists located in the academy to think that our work is somehow intellectually independent of broader political economic forces, especially given the heavy restructuring of funding for higher education institutions. And there is always a risk that those in power will use our findings in ways not necessarily intended by the researcher. I know Jean has talked about this with her communities of practice concept and has had to try to push back and redirect ways in which it has been used. So advocacy of some sort, I would argue, is always present in anthropological work. Even deciding against action in some sort of arena of social contestation in and of itself constitutes a stance, right? And especially, some have argued, in settings of gross injustice and inequality, this is actually Singer I'm quoting, neutrality is in fact a kind of partisanship on behalf of the status quo. So at the same time that we acknowledge that, we must also extend that kind of skepticism to our own political commitments and our own advocacy work, right? So ultimately, I'm going to try to argue that we need to engage, but we also need to critique and be skeptical, hold that skepticism not only to others' social practices, but to our own. There are two other reasons, I would argue, for this continued allegiance to this dichotomy of anthropology and applied. Those are the sense among some that applied anthropologists get so focused on their change goal that they ignore the more holistic commitments of the discipline. And I think that is something for us to think about. And there's also the exhortation that we need to remain skeptical even about our own commitments. So in thinking about this, I was looking at Shirley Bryce Heath's article, New Love, Long Love, Keeping Social Justice and Ethnography of Education in Mind, which she published in 2011. And she talks about Del Hymes and his enthusiasm for educational ethnography as he embodied it in his role as dean at Penn, which Stan could sort of talk about ways in which that has shifted since. But and she contrasts that then, his enthusiasm for educational ethnography, to his long-term love, his commitment to ethnopoetics among Native Americans on the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon. And so Heath tells us that in his role as dean, Hymes championed educational ethnography as a path to democratizing schools and society. According to Heath, Hymes believed that an ethnographic sensibility would enable people to see more deeply into one another's ways of behaving and believing, and that these kinds of insights would, as a consequence, generate more intense and meaningful communication, greater appreciation of human achievements like multilingualism, a spirit of tolerance, and a caring curiosity about others, if only, right? But he focused in particular on administrators as the target of that work. It's interesting. We tend to target teachers more with that work, and so according to Heath, he saw himself as working to make social justice a normative form of modern rationality that could generate certain social and linguistic practices that would constitute knowledge in such a way as to oblige schools to be institutions of reform, end quote. It's interesting to note that Himes adopted this tactic not too long after editing and publishing the radicalizing text, Reinventing Anthropology, which was a really important argument about the way anthropology was entangled with colonialism and the ways in which it needed to reposition itself politically. And yet, as Heath points out, Himes, she claims, was blinded by this new love of educational ethnography. She complained that he adopted an almost exclusive focus on classrooms, and that this held little room for the history and theories of anthropology or the kind of sustained systems approach that Dell advocated for in his long-loved work of ethnopoetics. She also complained, parenthetically, that Himes was unable to turn that kind of critical eye regarding inequalities on his own institution at Penn. And I think I've certainly been guilty of the same kind of thing. Something for all of us to think about. If we're honest, though, we might admit that there are other reasons for policing this division between academic and applied anthropology. In their article, Other Anthropologies and Anthropology Otherwise, published in 2005, Eduardo Restrepo and Arturo Escobar called for broadening anthropology beyond what the monoculture of knowledge that they call dominant anthropologies that predominate in the United States. And this is part of their effort to elaborate what they called a world anthropologies network. So we could have a conversation about this. I think there are some uncomfortable ways in which it gets mapped onto place that would be interesting to talk about. But nonetheless, dominant anthropologies, they complain, have constituted themselves as a set of differentiating interventions of what counts as anthropology and who an anthropologist is. These debates then tend to obliterate diversity and particular, they offer particular constructions of what is thinkable, right? So they argue in their piece, this is one piece by them, but there's a network of scholars working on these ideas in the World Anthropologies Network. They argue for the need to decolonize expertise, most obviously by questioning the privileging of knowledge ascribed to white U.S. academics, but also by blurring boundaries between academic and non-academic knowledge, which is where it sort of comes around to our discussion of applied versus non-applied anthropology. And those skills in order to include a wider swath of individuals in the category of expert, perhaps these expanding repertoires that Stanton was talking about. Second, they lend support to the efforts of post-colonial scholars in exploring how expert knowledge and so-called subaltern knowledges have been historically constructed and how this distinction is maintained through the structures of the academy. And finally, they deconstruct the discipline in a thorough critique of the epistemological and political space in which dominant anthropologies, meaning departments and journals largely located in the United States, have come to define what counts as anthropology. So this is a quote from them. These modalities of articulating anthropology are indissolubly embedded in particular institutional settings and linked to political economies. They subtly regulate the production of possible discourses, the terms of the agreements, and they affect a normalization of anthropological subjectivities. There is a multiplicity of academic and institutional practices, for example, training, research, writing, publishing, and hiring, that constitute obvious mechanisms of foreclosure of the conditions of reproduction and consolidation of the dominant anthropology's establishment, end quote. So they recommend a number of moves in order to enable or in order to diversify world anthropologies or enable world anthropologies. It entails a diversification of knowledges and a critical awareness of the larger epistemic and political field in which anthropology emerged and continues to function. but also of the micro-practices and relations of power within and across different anthropological locations. So, thinking about the ways in which the discipline of anthropology works to sort of reinforce itself and defend its boundaries, and part of that being in relation to applied anthropology or in relation to schools of education or anthropologists located in schools of education. So if I think about these different reasons for distinguishing those, for dichotomizing in those ways, I think it's worthwhile to think about the idea that application is neither the discipline's scapegoat nor its savior, that instead we need to move beyond these dichotomies, at least a continuum notion, if not beyond that. Perhaps a repertoire notion can move us well beyond the continuum. So whether, we could discuss the adjective, practicing action, activist, public, engaged, medical, educational, dangerous, messy, whatever our adjective is, but I think there's value in thinking about all of us being positioned across, being positioned within those endeavors ourselves, and that no one among us is innocent in that. So then I want to close by thinking about criteria for possible futures, which is our topic for our final discussion. If we abandon that kind of dichotomous thinking about applied versus non-applied, how do we think about good anthropology? Well, the repertoires notion that Stanton presented certainly gives us one way to move forward that I think we should spend some time unpacking and considering. I wanted to talk about two other things for us to consider as we think about good anthropology. One is the quality of research, and the second is ethics. And I won't spend a lot of time on either of these because we could spend all day talking about either one. But it is worth noting that good and bad research is done in the academy. Good and bad research is done in the name of applied anthropology. So thinking about quality research that engages comparative perspectives, that draws liberally from other fields and other sources of knowledge, but remains grounded in the field's fundamental commitments, including the holistic. I can't remember how James Peacock called it, the much maligned holism. We all know that serious problems emerge when ethnographic methods or anthropological approaches are not guided by anthropological commitments and concepts. And I would argue this is one reason for the need for anthropologists in a school of education or in other places. There's a lot of opportunity within schools of education for anthropology. And I think we have a lot to contribute. I don't think we're positioned in these places to police how people are using anthropological concepts or methods. I see that stance sometimes among colleagues, and it makes me really uncomfortable because it doesn't acknowledge the expertise that interlocutors bring, and it doesn't think about what is in those repertoires that I might adopt and develop in order to expand my own ways of thinking. So quality, and then ethics. We could spend, of course, the day talking about this, but perhaps we could take up the definition that Ray offered at the very beginning of our discussion, standing up when people say stupid but consequential stuff about kids or about schools or about, fill in the blank. But more broadly, we might think that it entails, at a minimum, respect for the dignity and integrity and worth of participants, honesty, transparency, and an ethical obligation to consider the potential impact of our research, the process itself, and of its dissemination on those involved directly or indirectly. And there's lots more we could mine from, for example, the AAA Statement of Ethics that was recently debated and that we could pick up there. So in conclusion then, I think we have to rethink the dichotomy, the political uses of the dichotomy, try to move beyond the dichotomy, but at the same time balance whatever engagement we're endeavoring to make with a certain skepticism about the quality of our own work, skepticism about our motives, skepticism about the impact, and continually try to think our way through these dilemmas and entanglements that are required. Thank you very much.